Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name's Alison Brunier, and I'm delighted to be with you today from the World Health Organization in Geneva. Today, 10th of September, is World Suicide Prevention Day. Close to 800,000 people die every year from suicide. That's one person every 40 seconds. Tragically, suicide is the second leading cause of death among 15 to 29-year-olds. Every death by suicide is a tragedy that not only affects the family, the friends, the other loved ones of the person that's died, but also whole communities. Fortunately, however, when the right measures are taken at the right time, suicides can be prevented. I'm delighted to have with us today, live from New Zealand, Jazz Thornton, who is a mental health activist, and she'll be taking your questions. We're live from WHO's social media channels, from Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So please do send in your questions to Jazz during the course of the program. So Jazz, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
We're delighted to have Jazz, particularly as she's having a really busy time at the moment, launching a film that she stars in, if that's the right word, called The Girl on the Bridge. And we'll come to talk about that a little bit later. But first of all, Jazz, can you tell the viewers a little bit about your background and what led you to become a mental health activist?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a very small town here in New Zealand, and I had a pretty rough childhood at points, with, childhood abuse and bullying. And when I was 12 years old, I made a decision that no 12-year-old should ever make, and that was the decision to try and end my own life. And throughout the rest of my teenage years, I severely battled with mental illness and tried to take my own life several more times. I ended up in psychiatric units for months, and I just remember waking up every day just wholeheartedly believing that the world was without me. But that kind of process that I went through through my teenage years is the reason that I now do what I do.
Okay, thank you very much for just opening and with that introduction a little bit about your background, Jazz. Jazz, can you tell us, you obviously did survive these suicide attempts and have come through to be an extremely inspirational mental health activist. Can you tell us what were the most important factors in helping you realize that you could recover from the severe distress that led you to those suicide attempts?
I remember after my final attempt, I had a conversation that really just kind of sparked something in me. And it was with a woman, her name is Esther. She's known me for many years. And I remember her just looking at me, and I was crying, and she just said, "Jazz, why are you crying?" And I looked at her and said, "I'm just so tired of fighting." And she looked at me and went, "Jazz, what do you think the definition of fighting is? Because I don't know if you've been fighting. I think you're only surviving. And it's only when you learn how to fight, that's when the change that you're longing to see is going to happen." And I remember taking that and going, okay, hang on a second. If I've actually been surviving for all of these years and fighting's going to change something, I have to learn how to do that. And so I began to do a whole lot of practical things, like writing down my core beliefs that were, I'm a burden, I'm unlovable, I don't deserve to be. I would draw a line, and on the other side, I wrote down everything that people said or did that contradicted those beliefs, so that every time my mind would say these things, I could pull this list out and have rock hard evidence in front of me that my internal reality wasn't matching the external truth. And it was a whole bunch of practical things like that where I began to learn how to really engage in the fight that saw me go from suicidal to hopeful.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And again, your story is an inspiration. I'm sure many people who are watching us, because suicide is so prevalent in the world, either know somebody who has died by suicide or who is struggling very much. So the advice that you can give is extremely helpful. On particular point, and what advice would you have for people who are watching, who feel that life is no longer worth living?
I think my biggest piece of advice is that even though you might be struggling right now, it's really important to remember that this is just one scene of the movie of your life. It can get better, but it's really important that you reach out and ask for help, because this isn't something that you can do by yourself. We as humans weren't designed isolated. We're designed to have, relationship with people. And so the bravest thing that you can do, phone, friend, call a counselor, call a helpline, reach out to someone just to start off with, to know that you're not battling this by yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Jazz. And a really important message for people watching us to remember is, if you are struggling, then it's so important to reach out for help. Or if you know someone that's struggling, tell them that you're there for them. Tell them that if they need to talk, you're there to support them. We're starting to get some questions coming in now. Thank you very much to our viewers for sending in your questions. Just as a reminder, we're live from the World Health Organization in Geneva on the occasion of World Suicide Prevention Day. And we have with us a mental health activist, Jazz Thornton, who is live from New Zealand. So a first question, and perhaps you'd like to just reflect on this a little bit and give a few thoughts, Jazz. So a question from Chetna Barajwa, I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. What are the most important first signs of suicide or imminent suicide, that somebody might be thinking about suicide? Perhaps you can talk from your personal experience first of all, Jazz.
I think it can be, it's not necessarily one sign or, the top thing to look out for, that I've come to discover anyway. But the thing that I often did when I was, starting to head down that road and was thinking about taking my own life, is that I would begin to isolate and pull away from everyone. So sometimes that looked like acting up and, trying to force people out of my life, or it looked like, not going out and hanging out with my friends anymore, and not, going to work and all of those kinds of things. And I think that the beginnings of isolation is a bit of a telltale sign that there's something going on. That was definitely, I think, the biggest kind of consistent sign for me throughout my teenage years.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jazz. And as you say, I mean, there's not one, 2 or 3 particular signs that are common to everybody. It's different for many people, but certainly these signs of withdrawal, withdrawing from activities that one would normally enjoy, not wanting to go out, not wanting to go to work, severe sadness, feelings of distress, all of these things indicate that, as you said, that there might be something going on, and that somebody is in need of help. We have another question here from Twitter, from somebody who is a counsellor. As a counsellor, how can I reach out to more people to help them, or just listen to them? And this is something, Jazz, of course, that you have done a lot of over the years, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But would you like to respond to that question? How to reach out to more people, or just listen to them?
I think that, the biggest thing, us as humans, we have kind of been designed, I guess, in the way of relationship, that we have gone, hey, how are you? Yeah, good, thanks. How are you? And then you just move on with your day. That's, how we know what to do when it comes to work or seeing someone on the street. But I think taking the time, it's very, very simple, but taking the time intentionally to ask people how they are, and then giving them time to actually how are you really doing? Like, how's your home life? How's your work life? How are you managing? I think taking that very simple fundamental of relationship, that question of how are you, and creating the space to actually engage in a conversation is a really good step, especially as a counselor, because you're trained to listen. But I think it's about really intentionally creating that space, whether it is, in the corridor or on the street when you see someone, rather than just the very brief interaction. How are you? Yeah, good, move on. Take the time.
Okay, thank you, Jazz. The sound's cutting out a little bit from time to time in Geneva. Just a reminder to everybody, we're live from Geneva at WHO on the occasion of World Suicide Prevention Day. And we're delighted to have with us today Jazz Thornton, who is a mental health activist from New Zealand. Jazz, I have a question here. How to cope with loss when you know someone who has died by suicide. But perhaps before answering this question, now might be a good time to talk a little bit about the film, The Girl on the Bridge, that is going on general release in New Zealand today, that was directed by award-winning film director Leanne Pooley, and basically traces 2 years in your life when you yourself were making a documentary about a friend of yours, Jess, who tragically died by suicide. And the film actually does demonstrate to a large extent an answer to this question, how to cope with loss when you know somebody who has died by suicide. So we'd like to see whether we can make the technology work across the world and watch a trailer of this film that's going on general release in New Zealand today.
8 days, I have received 6 goodbye messages from people. I have literally had to restrain someone who was trying to take their life. I have been on the phone to someone else who was about to take their life. It has been one heck of a week.
Our epidemic that we call suicide is no longer something that we can survive through, but we must learn how to fight.
Our generation is sitting here like we're the ones that are dying, and therefore we have to be the ones that will stand up and solve it because no one else is going to. My name's Jazz. I was once the person on the other side. I was once the person wanting to jump off the bridge, planning how I was going to die. You're consumed by that 24/7.
Because young people identify with her, they contact her constantly.
There's not a single thing in my life that is not to do with suicide. You've got people talking to you every single day, not wanting to be here anymore.
Yeah. It's weird how normal that is to me now. We're all the sum of different lives. The reasons why people get to this place isn't a simple equation.
You just got really overwhelmed with it all.
I'm terrified of waking up the next day to someone's suicide message and...
Can't be the world counsellor.
The thing is, I was so careful not to give anyone enough information about me that they would know how broken I really was. So many lines.
She feels all these things and you can't explain it, you don't...
This won't be easy, and it's human to turn away from pain.
I am so angry. Why is it easier to get pizza delivered to your house than it is to access a crisis worker when you're about to kill yourself?
This is the problem. No one knows what to do to help.
I just want to give my daughter a hug. She's found a purpose for all that journey that she's been on. Man, that's going to take a lot of courage.
They're your friends, they're your family, they're your work colleagues, they're your neighbours. It's time that we become a society where people actually feel like they can ask for help.
So that was a trailer for The Girl on the Bridge, a film that was directed by award-winning New Zealand director Leanne Pooley, and that is going on general release in New Zealand today. Jazz, can you say a few words about what led to the making of this film, The Girl on the Bridge?
I am a director by trade. I was studying TV directing in 2017, and I really wanted to tell the story of a friend of mine, Jess, who I lost to suicide in 2015. She always wanted her story to be told, and our stories were really parallel. And so I decided to pitch the idea of telling Jess's story as a series. And when I did that, the panel that I was pitching to were like, oh, there's a film in this. So I sat down with Leanne Pooley, who is now the director of The Girl on the Bridge, and she was just supposed to be a creative consultant for the series. And then after about 2 minutes was like, actually, I think there is a film in this, and the film is about you. And that was terrifying. I had cameras follow me for about 2.5 years while I was creating Jessica's Tree, but she thought that there was really going to be something in the journey that I was about to embark on trying to tell a story about suicide with a lot of the conversations that are happening worldwide, and how do we have those conversations, and the journey I was going to be up against of the fact I'm still here and she isn't. And you kind of see that throughout the film, the journey of guilt that I went on, that I felt from her passing, and how I began to overcome that. But it was definitely a long process. So we got the film in 2017, and it's obviously on release now.
Okay, thank you very much, Jazz, and it's a very powerful film that will be available for further viewing from the website in the coming weeks, the website of The Girl on the Bridge. So we have a lot of questions coming in now. As a reminder, today, 10th of September, it is World Suicide Prevention Day, and we're coming to you live from WHO in Geneva with Jazz Thornton, mental health activist from New Zealand, who is taking your questions. So we have a question here on Twitter from Dilashma. Jazz, what are the right things to say when someone you know is talking about suicide? This is a very good question.
That is a very good question. I think that the very kind of beginning thing to make sure is when you say the phrase to someone, oh, it's going to be okay, what you need to know is that for someone who is feeling suicidal, saying that minimizes everything that the person is going through. I remember hating it every time someone knew that I was struggling and would say, oh, it's going to be okay, because to me, I was like, actually, I don't want to be alive anymore, and you telling me that everything's going to be okay, it minimizes everything that I'm feeling. So what I found really helpful was when people were like, Jazz, I'm so sorry to hear that you are struggling with this, but here are some things that we can do. Let me call your doctor. Let me see if we can get you into counseling. But the other thing that people did is, when I was struggling with not wanting to be here anymore, the beliefs that I talked about earlier in this live about being a burden, feeling like I was unlovable, the people around me chose to constantly speak against those beliefs. So, every day, hey, Jazz, we love you. Hey, Jazz, we're proud of you. Hey, Jazz, remember that you're not a burden. And having that consistently really helped when I was feeling that way. But also, don't be afraid to ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? So many people are afraid that doing that might put the idea into someone's head, but it doesn't. It just gives them the freedom and the ability to actually talk about it.
Thank you, Jess. An important question and an excellent answer. I'd just like to take the opportunity as well to let our viewers know that during the course of the day, we will be posting on our social media channels a number of materials for the general public, for you, about suicide, what you can do if you know somebody that is struggling, what you can do if you are struggling yourself, and who to reach out to. We have a question here that I would like to just touch on briefly. It's an important one from Joseph Mitoli, and that's, what's the wisdom of jailing suicide survivors? Now, perhaps I can just answer this myself. WHO's position on this is that feelings of suicide are a public health issue. It is not attempting suicide is not a criminal act and should not be treated as such. So that's very, very clear. People who are thinking about suicide need help, essentially. Again, lots of questions coming in. Let's see. A question here from LinkedIn, Tanmay, from Tanmay. Suicide is increasing. There are a number we hear a lot of reports about suicide in the media. And she asks, or he asks, is it mentalities, psychological problems, family issues, genes that could be causing suicide? Of course, there are very many factors that can lead somebody to think about suicide. But Jazz, would you like to comment on that question?
Sure. I think, like what you said, there are so many reasons why you can get to this. Definitely can't put it down to one thing. I know that among young people, for example, bullying is really big. Obviously, social media and the pressure of social media and being accessible at all times is very overwhelming. You've got, child abuse rates are very, very high. And I know that that was obviously my own story, and many people who talk to me have that similar experience as well. But also there's a whole lot of situational things as well, such as job loss or feeling like you can't provide for your family, feeling like a failure. So I don't think that there is, you can't really put it into one kind of reason. There are so many societal factors that can contribute to that. But that also means that there are so many areas in which that we can focus on and try to improve, because suicide isn't necessarily the beginning, it's not the beginning of the issue, it's the result of many, many issues. And so if we can start to focus on all of those things as they come up, and we're not going to be able to target everything in one go, but looking at the way that we choose to respond and how we have conversations and how we engage in workplaces and schools is really important.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jazz. There are quite a lot of questions coming in from our viewers about coping with loss when you lose somebody from suicide. And again, this you can speak to, I know from your personal experience, it comes across very, very strongly in The Girl on the Bridge, the film we mentioned. So this question is how to manage, from Caroline Jadia, how to manage the feeling of guilt or failure when someone dies from suicide.
That is definitely the biggest thing, I think, that I went through in losing Jess and many others that I have lost to suicide, is if you have lost anyone, that I think the question of what if is soul destroying. What if I picked up the phone? What if I called them? What if I didn't say this? What if I had known earlier? What if I had seen them that day? And those what if statements absolutely can destroy you. They did for me. And I went through, especially creating The Girl on the Bridge, I was constantly, but what if I had just seen her message earlier that day? But what if I had just chosen to reply? And what I began to realize was, as much as I can continuously ask these what ifs, that doesn't bring these people back. What I can do now is that I can, in my everyday life, attempt to create the environment that they needed when they were still here, that I can, facilitate the conversations that they needed to have, that I can be part of creating the change that they needed. And that doesn't mean that you have to take, the losing someone and go out and change the whole world. But I do think that you can go out and fight for them, whether it be, within your family and your friends, and choosing to have those conversations earlier, but just knowing that it is not your fault. The people who are taking their own life, I can, from my own experience, can say that in that moment, I wholeheartedly believed that the world would be better off without me. And it didn't matter who was talking to me. It didn't matter if someone had called me. I did not want to be here. And so I think it's really important to remember that it is not your fault. There are so many situations that can lead a person to feeling like this. And while we can't take back the past, we can alter how we choose to respond in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Jazz. I'm sure that will be of comfort to a lot of people who are watching us today. So we also have a comment. We got a lot of questions and comments coming in. Here's a comment, actually, from Very Positive, from Facebook, from Indrani. who says, I made 3 attempts of suicide, but am now very confident and positive. Meditation has helped me overcome the problem. Well, that's again an inspirational story and a proof that one can come out of feelings of suicidal thoughts and ideation. So it is possible to overcome feelings of suicide. Perhaps just before we go on, a couple of points to make about key interventions that can be made at governmental level and at national level that have shown to be successful in reducing the number of suicides within countries. And there are basically 4 key elements. One is restricting access to means of suicide. Secondly is building life skills among young people and enable them to cope with life stresses. Thirdly is responsible reporting by media about suicide. And fourthly is early identification, management and follow-up of people at risk of suicide. Perhaps, Jazz, if I could just stop for a moment on that third one, which is the responsible reporting of suicide by the media and the role that the media have to play. Would you like to comment briefly on that?
Yeah, definitely. Here in New Zealand, when I was creating Jessica's Tree, the show that The Girl on the Bridge is about, I actually ended up going into one of our biggest media outlets and having a conversation with them because they had turned the headline of this article into a very clickbait, sensationalizing headline. And I sat down and was like, mental health and suicide and people's stories are not clickbait. And I think that when it comes to media reporting, we've got really, I think, good guidelines here. We follow the WHO guidelines pretty strictly in regards to not reporting on method and location, which I know a lot of countries don't do. They do report on these things. And I think that the media has one of the biggest parts to play in this because we are constantly fed this information. And as someone who, was suicidal, I can say that if I saw, okay, this is how someone took their own life, then I would be likely to try and do the same thing. So copycat within media is a very real thing. But they also have a responsibility to not just share the tragic stories, but to also share the hope stories, because otherwise it can become overwhelmingly negative in the way of feeling like there's no hope, there's no way we're going to get through this. What's the point in trying? And I definitely wish that I had more of the hope-filled stories when I was going through it, that I had more of the stories of the people who had got through it and less of the graphic imagery and the location and the methods, because that kind of stuff people don't need to know. And if you've never experienced suicidal thoughts and you're just curious, I think it's better that we safeguard those who are experiencing those things by not putting it in rather than just trying to cater to your curiosity.
Thanks a lot, Jazz. So a very important role to play by media in being responsible when reporting on suicide. You talked about hope, Jazz. Perhaps now's a good time to just introduce your NGO, your non-governmental organisation, Voices of Hope. Would you like to say a few words about what that is and what you're trying to do through that organisation?
We created Voices of Hope at the beginning of 2017, myself and my co-founder, Genevieve Mora. And what we decided to do was that when I was battling in and out of psychiatric wards, I remember thinking, I just wanted to see someone who had got through it. I just wanted to know that it was possible. And no one was talking about it back then. And I didn't find any stories of people that had been where I was and were now, through the other side. So we decided to combine our passion for storytelling and mental health. And we began to do creative content and campaigns around mental health and suicide, all from voices of those with lived experience. We started to do series, obviously, like Jessica's Tree. Our very first video was one called Dear Suicidal Me, which got around 80 million views, which had people who had attempted to take their own life but are now living fulfilled lives and writing letters to themselves. We also try to add the lived experience voice into all kinds of areas, whether it be, the creative side, but also in government advocacy and looking at where funding's going and things like that. we've been able to do it both here in New Zealand and around the world, with a whole bunch of people, which have been amazing. We've shot campaigns in America, in the UK, in Indonesia, and we've begun to understand that mental health and suicide is obviously a global issue, and the voices of those with lived experience that carry hope are so vital in creating change.
Thank you very much, Jazz. So again, we have a lot more questions coming in. For those of you who've just joined us, today is World Suicide Prevention Day, and we're live from Geneva, from the WHO, and we're delighted to have with us Jazz Thornton, live from New Zealand, who is a mental health activist. Jazz, there are quite a few questions coming in like this. One on Facebook from Amani El-Shanawi, who says, how do we know if a friend is in danger and might be thinking about suicide?
That's a really good question. And I think that, specifically around days like World Suicide Prevention Day, when we're all talking about this topic, I just think that there are kind of key things that we were talking about earlier where, people might be isolating or start having lack of interest in things. But again, like I have said, it's if you feel like someone is thinking that way, it is so much better to just ask the question than kind of just wonder and be like, oh, I don't know if they are or not. I remember the first time someone asked me, Jazz, are you feeling suicidal? And I was a little bit taken back by it, but I also felt for the first time, oh my gosh, I'm allowed to talk about this. I'm allowed to tell someone how I'm feeling without them completely, overreacting and scaring me. They just sat with me and were like, okay, what can we do to get through this? But I think ultimately just asking the question is the first and most important step, and then being ready to, whether it is sit with them or call a doctor if you can, or a counselor if you can. But if not, just be with them. Them being able to share with one person that they are struggling does the world of good for someone who is feeling so isolated.
Okay, thank you very much. Quite a lot of comments coming in, people sharing their own experiences as well. I would like to share this one from Lizelle Fitzgibbon, who says, I am a self-harmer. I'm 40 years old this year and have suffered severe depression, agoraphobia, bipolar disorder, and severe anxiety since I was 15. But I want people to be aware there is always someone there to listen. Remember, you're not alone. Reach out. Thank you very much for sharing that, Lizelle. It's a very important message for people who are listening to us today. Another question here from Facebook, from Mapati Goala, watching from South Africa, and Richards Bay. And he asks, how can we prevent people having suicidal thoughts?
Oh, I think that the biggest thing for this comes down to community and how we treat one another. I think that, going back to the fundamental ways of how we do relationship, if someone, when I was 12 years old and first attempted to take my own life, if someone took the time to sit with me and to ask me how I was really feeling before that, and really kind of engaged and was there for me, I think I would have been prevented from the many years that I did then go into kind of crisis mode of struggling. And I think that it's really important to remember that when these kind of emotions and things are coming up for people, that if we can engage in our early conversations and the way, when we're with our kids, when we've got relationships with our kids and we're asking them, how was your day? Not doing that whilst, trying to prepare something else, but actually taking time to sit down and to have a conversation. I think that obviously services and government, the facilities that we have are super, super important. But ultimately, suicide prevention is everyone's responsibility. And it's up to us. When we do high school presentations, we often talk about, an example in bullying. You've got the victim, the bully, and then the bystander. And the person that is the most powerful in that situation and the most influential is the bystander, the person who has the ability to jump in and to to say, actually, no, that's not a good thing to say. Actually, no, that's not okay. And I think when it comes to society, if you hear someone say, oh, it's just attention seeking, or saying things like that in everyday conversation, jumping in and saying, no, it's actually not. They're just looking for help, or, being the person who will go and sit with someone who is by themselves. I think as a society, we can just be a lot kinder. And I think kindness goes a long way.
Yes, it's very, very true. Just to touch back, you're talking about younger people there, and what one can do when one's a bystander, if you like, to people who are struggling or going through difficult situations. Can you just say a few words about what you're planning to do with the girl on the bridge in terms of using it for suicide prevention efforts?
100%. This film was designed to hopefully help people learn how to have these conversations, to break down some of the fears around that. And so what we're doing with the international release of The Girl on the Bridge, which is the 21st of September, we are making it available to community groups and businesses and schools to be able to host screenings. And then there are packs that have been developed as well that can help people facilitate having the conversations afterwards with their communities and businesses. We are releasing it into every country to ensure that everyone can watch it and can have access to it. But we're really hoping that it's going to be able to break down some of the stigmas and the fears and the mindsets that come around people who are suicidal. And a lot of it has been, kind of created, I guess, for what we were talking about in regards to the bystander, maybe, which is, a lot of society, the people who kind of want to do something to help, but also don't really know what to do and don't know how to say the right things, or, if they're going to say something triggering. And so we're really hoping that this film helps people understand better so that they can then change their response. But that'll be available on the 21st of September.
Thanks, Jazz. So a few more questions coming in. This one is from Tracy, who says, I have heard some doctors say that suicide or depression is a disease that can hit anyone and can even be genetic, meaning there doesn't necessarily have to be a societal or experiential reason behind it. Perhaps just before handing over to Jazz on this one, the reasons why people try and take their own lives are many and complex, and often many at the same time. A severe depression can be one of the reasons leading somebody to be thinking about suicide, but there are many, many others. Jazz, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, 100%. There are severe depression, and there is clinical reasons for that. Life may seem totally fine, and we see that a lot. I actually was speaking at a finance conference a couple of years ago with a whole lot of CEOs of the financial industries, and this man in his late 50s came up to me afterwards and said that he had been struggling so much with depression and had thoughts of taking his own life, and he didn't understand why. He had the job, he had kids, he had the finances. On paper, he had the perfect life, but he was still feeling that way, and it made him feel guilty. And like he didn't want to speak up because he had, no reason to feel like that. But that's not something, depression and mental illnesses that are, clinical, while there are obviously things that you can do to help that. Again, I still think that society can still play a part in helping those people. It doesn't mean that you're a lost cause. It doesn't mean that you're too far gone. If it is a clinical diagnosis like that, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done for you and this is just how it's going to be forever. That's why we have psychiatrists and psychologists and therapies that have been developed, and why having strong family networks and community networks is so important, because you might be diagnosed with this for your life, but you definitely don't have to live in the lowest points of that. It is possible for you to still live a normal life if you can develop these tools and have the resources and people around you to do so. I don't know if she's still there.
Okay, so coming towards the end of our show now, we have another 5 minutes. We've still got a lot of questions coming in. Just a reminder to our viewers, we will be on WHO's social media channels providing lots of information, advice about suicide during the course of today, World Suicide Prevention Day. So here's a question, last couple of questions. David, on LinkedIn, there are very many cases of youth suicide very many cases of youth suicide. What can be done to bring these cases down? And indeed, David, you're absolutely right. And suicide, tragically, is the second leading cause of death among young people 15 to 29 years old. So Jazz, you of course have a good experience in this area. What are some of the things that can be done to bring cases of suicide among young people down?
I think one of the biggest things is early intervention, teaching mental health in schools from early ages. I remember when I was in high school, probably having maybe 1 or 2 classes on mental health. And so there was still so much kind of stigma and feeling like I was the only one going through it. But I think that the education system can very much be developed to have mental health as something that is taught from a young age, resilience and mental well-being, something that we discuss on a regular ongoing basis. I also think that things like social media, being aware of what teenagers are seeing, and if you are a parent that is watching, I think it's really important that you have time where you yourself put your phone down and encourage your teenagers to do the same thing, because we're living in a very different generation where we are accessible at all times. You know, when the older generation were going to school, you could go to school, and if there was bullying or anything like that, when you left, you weren't in contact with these people all the time, whereas now you go home and it's still there. So being able to switch off, even if it's for a couple of hours a week, is really significant. But I think breaking down the stigmas, this is something I know worldwide is one of the biggest reasons that young people don't speak up early, is that they get called attention seekers. And as someone who was actively suicidal for a lot of my teenage years, that stigma that, oh, she's just attention seeking, that was put on me from people like teachers. And I remember a counselor once said that the principal of my school, it made me not want to speak up. And so I think that if we can begin to change that from attention seeking to help seeking, then teenagers will feel like they can ask for help earlier on rather than being afraid of what you're going to say.
Thank you, Jazz. So we'd love to keep you on longer. There's still a lot of questions coming in, but it is an important day for you, as it's the launch, the general release of your film, The Girl on the Bridge, in New Zealand, and you're due to speak very shortly at that launch. But maybe just to end, I wanted to share a comment that came in earlier on from Chantal Blakelock, and I'm sure this is a sentiment that's shared by many people that are watching. Jazz, you are so awesome. So proud of what you have been doing here in New Zealand and around the world. Stay strong. We are stronger together. And I think that's a great message to end on. So Jazz, thank you so much for joining us and speaking so well about this really difficult and important issue. And very best of luck with the launch of your film. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So that's all from WHO for today's Social Media Live. Again, thanks a lot for joining us, and thank you so much for sending in all your questions. We will be communicating more on all of our social media channels about this issue during the course of today. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.